A millionaire rescued a freezing homeless woman on the highway and took his home. However, he was shocked when he turned on the TV and saw that woman. The air outside was chilly, but Christian barely noticed. His luxurious foreign car kept him warm as it whisked him toward the Howard family estate. The Howards ran a massive furniture company, catering to a wide range of customers. Christian's father, Raymond, had launched the business back in the 90s and had managed to keep it afloat even through tough economic times. However, 5 years ago, Raymond stepped down from the business, and shortly after, he passed away, his only regret being that he never got the chance to spend time with grandchildren. Christian's wife, Rachel, had firmly refused to have children during the early years of their marriage. "No way," she had scoffed. "I'm not ruining my body for that." She had insisted they revisit the idea in 10 years, saying she wanted to focus on herself in the meantime. "Leave me alone with all this talk of kids," she'd say. And so Christian's father died, never knowing the joy of being a grandfather. "You would have been an amazing grandpa, Dad," Christian thought, his grip tightening on the steering wheel, bitterness welling up inside him. Not a day passed where he didn't think about his father. "Good people don't fade from memory," he mused. "Time only proves that." Oddly enough, Christian's mother, Barbara, had always sided with Rachel on the issue, which led to frequent arguments. "You two have the same disdain for people," Raymond would often rebruce. "Both of you treat the employees like they're beneath you, even though you're not exactly special yourselves. You're just the wives of business owners, not goddesses." "Get over yourselves," Raymond would continue. "If you're not contributing to society, at least don't flaunt your wealth. It's revolting." After getting a talking to like that, Barbara and Rachel would dial back their arrogance for a short while, avoiding sneers and condescending attitudes toward the staff. But it never lasted long. Before anyone knew it, they were back to acting entitled, expecting to be treated like royalty. Meanwhile, the bond between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law only grew, while their love for their husbands seemed to weaken. "Dad, I want a divorce," Christian said aloud. Christian once confided in his ailing father. "I can't take it anymore. I'm tired of Rachel's attitude. Her constant looks of dissatisfaction and disdain are driving me crazy. I just can't deal with it. This doesn't feel like a marriage when your wife takes vacations alone and doesn't even want kids. She doesn't love me, Dad, and I know it for sure." Raymond sighed, replying, "Well, son, follow your heart. You're still young, and you have time to fix things. One day, you'll meet the right girl, someone who will care about more than just your money, but also share your worries. I just can't do it anymore. Mum wouldn't survive a divorce, and honestly, I'm used to Rachel. We've been through so much together. Poverty, the fear of gangs, all sorts of things. That's why I let some of her silliness slide. But Rachel doesn't deserve that kind of forgiveness. I'm sorry, son. I should have stopped you from marrying her when you had doubts. I didn't do enough." "Don't beat yourself up, Dad. It's my mistake, and I'll make it right," Christian replied. It was the last time he hugged his father while he was still alive. Raymond passed away from a heart attack early the next morning. Christian's grief was overwhelming, and he didn't even notice how his mother seemed to age overnight, her face weary and worn. After the funeral, Christian felt no pull to return home. The warmth of evenings by the fireplace, the laughter over clever jokes, those moments were gone. Instead, Rachel's cold stares and silence greeted him each night. "Let's get a divorce," Christian said to Rachel one day. "If that's what you want," Rachel responded with a pout, "but it's going to cost you." "I don't care how much it costs. I'll pay anything as long as I never have to see you again," Christian said firmly. "The lawyer will come with the papers tomorrow. I suggest you sign them." Rachel stayed quiet, but rushed to tell Barbara. Christian regretted not doing this earlier when his father was still alive. At least then, he would have had someone on his side. Now, a storm was coming, and it was in the form of his angry mother. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she yelled at him. "Rachel is a sweet girl, and you're just throwing her out?" "I'm not throwing her out, Mom. I'm just divorcing her," Christian said calmly. "Besides, she's got her own fancy apartment downtown and a big bank account with the money I gave her." "Oh, poor thing," his mother scoffed. Rachel, hiding behind her mother-in-law, made a sour face and muttered something into Barbara's ear. His mother frowned, then looked at Christian with disdain. "Do you have someone on the side? Admit it. Who is this woman you're sneaking around with?" "I don't have anyone," Christian shot back. "I just don't want to live the way you and Dad do anymore." "What did you say?" Barbara's eyes widened in shock. "Never mind," Christian muttered. "I'm just tired. I'm starving." A month later, they were divorced. Christian seemed to find a fresh start after the split, while his mother sank into depression. She began to waste away before his eyes, refusing to eat or even leave the house. At first, Christian thought she was punishing him for Rachel, but when Barbara started having difficulty walking, he had no choice but to drag her to the doctor. Until then, she had flat out refused to go to the hospital. Christian repeatedly asked Rachel to visit his mom, but she kept giving him lame excuses. He soon realized his ex-wife had been taking advantage of his mother's generosity all along, getting large amounts of cash from her on holidays and birthdays, which allowed her to stash away a nice little fortune. "Mom, stop waiting around for Rachel, and don't call her anymore," Christian warned her. "She used you. How could you not see it? She hasn't even bothered to visit you." "That's not true," his mother argued. "She's just busy. She'll come." Christian didn't push it further. Eventually, Barbara figured it out for herself when an old friend phoned her with some unsettling news. "You won't believe this, but I overheard Rachel calling you a crazy old woman," her friend told her. "She said living with you was like living in hell." "What? How could she say that?" Barbara was crushed. After that call, she felt ashamed in front of Christian, but couldn't bring herself to admit it. She had been deeply attached to Rachel, missing her terribly. Maybe because Rachel reminded her of her younger self. And it's hard to let go of your youth. Once Rachel was out of the picture, Barbara practically stayed in bed all day. Christian hired a skilled nurse to care for her, someone who could read to her, chat with her, and deal with her quirks. "I don't like her," Barbara complained. "Get rid of her. She's clumsy and dumb." "As you wish," Christian sighed, and he hired someone new. Over the span of a year, more than a dozen nurses came and went, but none managed to meet his mother's expectations. Christian knew she was nitpicking, likely punishing him for divorcing Rachel. Multiple medical evaluations failed to pinpoint the cause of the mysterious paralysis that had taken hold of her legs. The doctors gave confusing diagnoses and eventually concluded they were dealing with some new and unstable condition. "Young man," the elderly professor told Christian, "I can only wish you patience. Don't lose hope. I suspect your mother's condition is tied to a psychological issue. My advice is to give her all the care and support you can, even though I know it won't be easy." Christian followed the doctor's advice, doing everything possible not to let his mother down. Sensing her son's vulnerability, she threw fits and made life miserable for the nurses. Word around town was that the mistress of the Howard mansion had lost her mind and grown bitter towards the world. Finding people willing to work in their home became increasingly difficult. Christian had to start offering double pay just to keep nurses and housekeepers on staff. All of this added to his stress, and things weren't any better at work. A shady competitor had emerged, playing dirty and driving investors and key clients away from Christian's business. hurting Howard's reputation. He constantly found himself needing to prove his capability and integrity, which only added to his frustration. Now, driving through the freezing fog after a long day, the last thing Christian wanted was to go home, where his mother's endless complaints about the staff awaited him. On top of that, he had to hire yet another new nurse. Out of nowhere, a woman suddenly dashed from the forest onto the road, collapsing in the middle of the street. Christian barely managed to stop in time. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" he shouted in fear. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman remained motionless. Christian rushed to her side, leaning down to see if she was conscious. She was young, but showed no signs of life. He began shaking her, trying to wake her up. Her body was ice cold, her hands rigid from the freezing temperatures, and her eyelashes and hair coated in frost. "Stay with me. Don't fall asleep," Christian yelled. Finally, she opened her eyes, but she was extremely weak. The woman muttered, "Helped me." Christian gently helped her to her feet and guided her to his car. He cranked up the heat and poured some hot tea from a thermos. She was so chilled, her hands shook too much to hold the cup. So, Christian carefully helped her drink, holding the cup to her lips. After a few moments, the woman finally began to regain warmth and composure. She looked at Christian with a mix of fear and relief, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for saving me," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought I'd never get out of that forest." Christian shook his head in disbelief. "How did you even end up out there? Who goes walking in the woods alone at night, especially when it's freezing? You scared the heck out of me when I saw you." The woman looked down and whispered, "I'm scared too." "But why were you out there by yourself?" Christian pressed. "What's your name? Where are you from?" "My name is Sandra Perry. I got off the bus at the wrong stop. I don't really have a home anymore, so I guess you could say I'm from nowhere." Christian nodded. "I'm Christian, so no place to go, huh? It sounds like the wandering life isn't for you. Look, I need some help at home, especially with taking care of my mum. She's a tough lady, though. Won't be easy. But if you're up for it, you can stay with me. What do you think?" Sandra gave a slight nod. "I don't really have another option, do I?" When they arrived, Sandra's eyes widened at the sight of the massive mansion. "This is like a castle," she gasped. Christian chuckled at her reaction. She wasn't showing envy or greed, unlike others, like Rachel. Sandra was awestruck when the staff politely helped her out of her coat. She stood there, wide-eyed, marveling at the huge chandelier and the classic art on the walls. "Come on, let's eat something," Christian said. "I'm sure you're hungry. So am I." Sandra stared at the grand table, loaded with dishes that smelled divine. Her mouth dropped open. "You call this a snack? This is a banquet." "Eat up," Christian laughed. For some reason, he felt better in her company. Life seemed to have a bit more brightness now. He finally got a good look at her. Sandra was a slender blonde, with soft features and big blue eyes, framed by thick lashes. She reminded him of Bambi. Fragile, like someone who needed protection. Her clothes were worn, but still neat and tidy. Christian noticed that even though Sandra was clearly hungry, she ate with grace, taking her time and using the knife and fork with precision. It was clear she had a certain refinement and poise about her. How did such a beautiful soul end up in a situation like this? "Do you need some help?" "Just say the word," he asked. Sandra looked directly at him and replied, "No, this is my issue, and I'll handle it, but thank you for offering." They continued their meal quietly, enjoying the well-prepared dishes. Afterward, Christian took Sandra to meet his mother. When Barbara laid eyes on the new caregiver, she immediately switched into her typical cold demeanor to assert her authority. "Hello, I'm Sandra, your new nurse," she said warmly. Barbara scoffed. "We'll see about that." Her eyes, scanning Sandra's simple outfit with a critical look. Sandra glanced over at Christian. He gave her a reassuring nod, silently telling her to stand firm. With a soft smile, Sandra confidently walked over to the bed, adjusted Barbara's pillow, and straightened the blanket. Then, she settled into the chair, grabbed the doctor's notes, and began reading them. Christian observed her closely, all while attempting to win over his mother by explaining how they had met. What Christian didn't realize was that his mother had already caught the way he looked at Sandra. There was a brief, gentle expression in his eyes, something close to admiration, and Barbara didn't like it. She was still holding out hope for Rachel, her former daughter-in-law, to return, so she directed her frustration and disapproval towards Sandra. The nurse's ordeal began sharply at 8 a.m. when Christian left the house and didn't stop until he returned around 7 p.m. Barbara was careful not to mistreat Sandra in front of her son, though. She could see clearly that her son was developing feelings for this pauper, as she called Sandra in her mind. "How much longer do I have to wait? Am I supposed to starve in here?" Barbara shouted when Sandra finally rushed in, slightly out of breath, carrying a tray into her room. "Sorry. I was just taking a little extra time to arrange the food nicely for you. See? This is a sprig of rosemary, and the fish looks fantastic. You should try it. The cook really outdid himself today." "It's finger-licking good," Sandra said kindly, brushing off the complaints. She wasn't upset with Barbara, understanding that being bedridden can make anyone cranky. After all, Barbara was the mother of the man who had saved her life and was beginning to feel more like family to her with each day. "Ugh, the fish is cold from how long it took you to bring it. Go get some hot food and make sure it's steaming. And no rosemary this time. Ugh, do I have to teach you everything? Hurry up. I still need to freshen up and put on some makeup. The girls are coming over." Barbara slumped back into her pillows, waving her hand dismissively like she was shooing away a fly. But things only got worse when the girls arrived. They were just as wealthy and self-absorbed as Barbara. They didn't mind talking about Sandra, even when she was right there in the room, treating her like she wasn't even human. Each day, putting up with Barbara's spoiled behavior was getting harder. "Look at her nails. No manicure," they whispered as Sandra cleaned the room. "And her hair. She looks like a street person. It's a shame to kick her out. She wouldn't survive. Barbara, you're too kind to tolerate such a ragamuffin near you." Sandra tried her best to ignore the mean gossip, even though she wanted nothing more than to shout back at them and storm out. Then, one day when Christian came home from work, the house was unusually quiet. No cheerful humming, no grumbling from his mother. The silence made him uneasy. "Sandra," he called out for her. "Sandra, come here." But no one rushed out of the kitchen to greet him with a smile and ask how his day was. Christian went upstairs to his mother's room. "Mum, where's Sandra? Did you send her to the store?" Barbara met his question with a frosty look. "Your little sweetheart ran off. Walked right out into the sunset. You might want to check the valuables. What if she stole something?" "Mum, what are you talking about? She's not a thief. Did you insult her? Be honest," Christian demanded. "I didn't go out of my way to insult your Sandra or give her any attention at all. She's not worth it. Why are you so worked up?" his mother said, narrowing her eyes. Since she had nowhere else to turn, Christian shrugged, feeling a mix of pity and unease. He tried not to let his mother see the frustration brewing inside him, so he flicked on the TV, hoping it would divert her attention. But that didn't work. The news was running, and suddenly a close-up of Sandra filled the screen. Both Christian and Barbara stopped in their tracks, listening intently to the broadcast. "We're reporting from the offices of Meridian Company, where Sandra Perry was employed as a cleaner," the reporter announced. "She allegedly stole a significant amount of cash from the company's safe before vanishing, Her current whereabouts are unknown. If anyone has information about Sandra Perry, please contact the authorities immediately. She has a 5-year-old son currently in a shelter, taken into protective custody after she lost her home. The boy still believes his mother will come for him, though surveillance has been increased around the shelter. Barbara, full of emotion, sat up in bed and said, "Well, how about that? What do you have to say now? Not a thief, huh? Look at who you let in the house. How many times do I have to tell you not to bring home strays? You did it as a kid, bringing in puppies and kittens, and I always had to find new homes for them. Do you know what my friends used to call me? The cat nanny. But I can't believe she's guilty of this." "There's no way she stole anything," Christian replied. "She might be a victim in all this. I need to figure out what's really going on." "Think hard, Christian. Rachel never gave us trouble like this," his mother said, trying to manipulate him. Christian, without a word, waved her off and left. The next day, he went to the shelter, hoping to find out more and maybe even run into Sandra. Feeling for the woman who had so patiently cared for his ill mother, Christian asked the staff, "Can I see the boy with the last name Perry? I'm here to visit him." "Donald Perry?" the caregiver asked, pointing toward a small boy with curly hair and striking blue eyes. "There he is," the caregiver called out. "Donald, someone's here to see you." "And who are you to him?" she asked Christian. "I'm a friend of his mom's," Christian explained. "I just found out he's here, and she's in trouble with the law. Has she shown up at all?" The caregiver sighed and stepped away from the other kids. "Yeah, Sandra came by to see him. She wanted to take him, but the police stepped in and took her away to the detention center. You should have seen how that little boy cried. It was enough to break your heart just watching him. Donald is such a sweet, kind kid. How could such a loving boy have a mother who's labeled a criminal? Could I spend some time with him? Maybe take him for a walk?" "Don't worry, I'll leave my ID with you," Christian suggested. "You'll have to check with the manager for permission," the caregiver said. After getting the green light and offering to help support the orphanage, Christian headed to the dining room to find Donald. The boy was sitting at the table, stirring his food with a spoon, clearly not interested in eating. His eyes were red from crying, and his nose was puffy from all the sobbing. Even now, he kept sniffling. At that moment, Christian had a realization. Maybe Donald's mother didn't leave because of Barbara. Maybe she just wanted to be with her child, who she missed so much. A mother's love had driven her to risk everything to see her son. That thought shook Christian to his core. His heart began to race, thinking about this woman who had become so important to him. He had to do whatever it took to help her child. She wasn't a criminal. She was a victim, Christian decided, letting go of any concern for what others might think. "Hey, Donald," he said softly. "Feeling lonely? I'm a friend of your mum's, Uncle Christian. How about we go for a walk?" "Hi, Christian. Are you really telling the truth? You really know my mum?" Donald asked, doubt in his voice. "Absolutely. Your mum's name is Sandra, and she's a really happy person," Christian replied with a smile. That was all the boy needed. He stretched out his arms, wrapped them around Christian's neck, and buried his face in his chest. "Some men took her away, and a lady said my mum is bad," Donald shared, his voice small and worried. "You have the best mom in the world, and I miss her too. But let's keep that between us, all right?" Christian whispered. Donald nodded seriously, understanding the weight of their secret. They stepped outside into the chilly air, the cold winter wind stinging Donald's face. He shivered. "Do you like car rides?" Christian asked. The boy's face lit up as he nodded. "One time, my mum and I took a taxi to the hospital when my throat hurt really bad. I liked it a lot." "Well then, let's go for a ride," Christian said, opening the car door. The boy climbed in, clearly excited. Donald pressed his nose against the car window, his eyes fixed on the cars and houses whizzing by. "Where are we going?" he asked curiously. "We're going to visit someone," Christian replied. "I love going on visits." Donald laughed. Along the way, they stopped at a toy store, and Christian told Donald he could pick out anything he wanted. The boy excitedly chose a small race car and a plush teddy bear, leaving the store with his new toys in hand, grinning from ear to ear. Christian's heart ached a bit, seeing how thrilled Donald was with such simple things. He couldn't help but feel for the boy. When they finally arrived at a large mansion, Donald's eyes widened as he took in the grand house. "How many people live in this giant place?" he asked. "Just my mum and me." Christian chuckled at Donald's awe-struck face. "Only 2 people in a house this big? Don't you get lonely?" Donald asked. "Very lonely," Christian replied with a smirk. "That's why I brought you here. We've got to soften up a very serious lady." "Is she really that tough?" Donald asked, his curiosity piqued. "How are we supposed to do that?" "We'll figure it out. Just don't let her in on our plan." "Okay, but you talk kinda funny, Christian," Donald said, shrugging. "Let's go meet this serious lady." Christian couldn't help but laugh, a deep, hearty laugh he hadn't felt in years, not since before he married Rachel. When they reached his mother's room, Christian was still chuckling as he led Donald inside. "Hi, lady. What's your name?" Donald asked boldly, peering at the older woman. She froze, looking from Donald to Christian in bewilderment. "Who is this?" she demanded, ignoring the boy's question. "Seems like you're being asked something, Mom." Christian smiled. "It's rude not to answer." After a brief pause, she said, "My name is Barbara, and I run this house. I don't like messes or noise, and I certainly—" She was interrupted as Donald placed his hand on her forehead, looking very serious. "You've got a fever, Barbara. You need to rest. We'll take care of you," he declared. "You should drink some cough syrup and get plenty of sleep." Barbara blinked, caught off guard, and glanced at Christian, not in anger this time, but in surprise. Suddenly, to Christian's amazement, she smiled. "No, Donald, I can't walk," she said, her tone softening. "Your legs are aching, aren't they?" the young boy asked, with genuine concern. "Well, we need to take care of that and give them some massages." Donald turned to Christian with a serious expression, asking, "Are you massaging Barbara? My mum used to do that for me. Honestly, Barbara's not tough at all. She's really soft." To prove his point, Donald gently touched Barbara's cheeks. Christian, catching his mum's puzzled glance, only said, "Mum, I'll explain later." Surprisingly, Barbara felt drawn to the boy, possibly because he reminded her of her own son, who used to be just as warm and caring. Donald and Christian's mother began chatting as if they'd been friends for years. Christian's son, feeling a bit like an outsider, watched from the side. But it didn't bother him. In fact, he noticed that his mother, who had been distant for so long, seemed to be softening. As they were leaving, Barbara invited Donald to come by again soon. The boy, thrilled, promised he'd bring her a surprise next time. On the ride back, Donald was quiet. He didn't want to return to the orphanage, and Christian, of course, could sense that. Before parting ways, Christian reassured him, "I'll see you tomorrow, I promise, Donald." Instead of replying, the boy hugged Christian tightly, then turned and walked slowly back to the group. He fought back tears, believing that boys shouldn't cry, though he wasn't very good at holding them back. Christian, on the other hand, felt a bit unsettled. He had sympathy for Donald and knew he'd be in for a difficult conversation with his mother soon. Donald had touched her heart. "She really lost custody?" Barbara asked, shocked after hearing the story from her son. She knew he had grown fond of the much-criticized caregiver and was ready to spite her by adopting Donald. Yet the boy had already won her over. In her shrewd mind, Barbara saw a way to achieve two goals: get back at the caregiver, who had captured Christian's attention, and finally gain the grandson she had always wanted. She began plotting. That evening, she called Christian over for a talk, expecting it to be an important one. Her gentle tone took Christian by surprise. "I've been thinking," she said. "Why don't you adopt Donald? We know his mother. She's not an addict or something worse. Life just hasn't been kind to her. Why should the boy suffer for her mistakes? I really like him. I think he would fit in perfectly with us." And the house instantly became more lively. "Do you remember how much your father longed for grandchildren?" Christian didn't see this coming. He thought his mom would once again beg him to give things another try with Rachel. So, he let out a sigh of relief. "Mom, I'm all in. I'm glad you brought it up yourself. I'll call the lawyer now. Meanwhile, think about where we should set up the kids' room." After Christian left, Barbara rubbed her hands together with joy. Now that Christian was on board, things were about to get interesting. She could finally humiliate Sandra and make her suffer. That woman would never get to see her son again. Barbara, filled with cruel satisfaction, thought, "Let her dare to show up here. I won't allow it. I'll turn this boy into everything Christian couldn't be." The adoption process went quickly, thanks to connections, and a smooth legal process. "I've got great news for you, Donald," Christian said, visiting the boy again. "From today, you're officially my son." "Really?" Donald's wide eyes looked up at him in surprise. He stopped playing and grew silent. "What about Mom? What will she say?" "She'll be happy when she comes back from her long business trip. She'll live with us," Christian assured him. "I want to be your son," Donald whispered. "And will Barbara be my grandma?" "Yes, she's very excited to have a grandson like you," Christian smiled. For a month now, Donald had been living in the Howard household as the newest member, with a new last name to match. "Grandma, when will Mom come back from her trip?" Donald asked Barbara one day. "Dad said we have to wait a long time, but how long is that?" "She's not on any business trip," Barbara snapped. "She's in jail because she stole money from her job. That's why they sent you to the shelter. Your mother is no good, worthless." "You're lying! You're bad!" Donald cried, his face streaked with tears as he bolted out of the room. Barbara hadn't expected such an outburst and sat down abruptly. From downstairs, the sound of Donald's sobs and Christian's voice could be heard. Christian had just returned from work. "Dad!" Donald sobbed, nearly hysterical. "Grandma said Mum steals money, and I'll never see her again. But she's good, she's kind." "Of course she is," Christian said gently, kneeling down to hold his son close. "Don't worry, everything's going to be all right. Tomorrow, I'll go see Mom, visit her, and let her know how well you've been behaving. I'll prove that they were wrong, and she was punished unfairly. Please help her," the child whispered through his tears. "How about we go play?" Christian suggested gently. "I thought about you all day while I was at work. I've really been wanting to play." "Hooray!" the boy shouted, his sadness forgotten for a moment. "Let's race the toy cars." "Let's go to my room," Christian said, trying to keep a cheerful face, though inside his heart was heavy. He was in love with Sandra, and it tore him apart that she was locked up. Neither he nor Donald visited Barbara that evening or the next day. She sat alone in her room, simmering with anger, cursing the day Sandra Perry had walked into her life. But one thing haunted her: the absence of her beloved grandson, whom she had grown so attached to and hadn't seen for 2 days. She missed him. She feared admitting to herself that a small part of Sandra had crept into her cold heart. "Sandra Perry, time to go out," a guard shouted. "No belongings." Sandra, looking around anxiously, stepped out of her cell and followed the guard. She was led into the visitors' room. Sitting at the table was Christian. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw him. "Christian, I'm so glad you came," Sandra exclaimed. "Hey, Sandra," Christian said calmly. "I brought you some stuff, food, sweets, and other things. Let me know if you need anything else. Oh, and I've arranged for a TV to be installed in your cell tonight. Also, I've adopted Donald. He's with me now." "What? How? From where?" Sandra's face went pale. "Yeah, Donald is doing great. He even calls me Dad now. But don't worry. When you get out, I'll help you get him back. But you need to tell me everything. How did this all happen?" Sandra stared at Christian, trying to process everything he was saying. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm relieved Donald's in good hands, someone I trust." She paused, locking eyes with Christian. "What about you? You're not indifferent to me. As for the money, I didn't steal it. I was set up. I think they hired me just so they could pin a major theft on me. The women in the cell explained it all to me. I think it was Michelle Miller, the head accountant, and Bruce Graham, the HR director. Those two were romantically involved, and I was just a janitor. No one believed me. They asked me to clean around the safe and leave the keys on Michelle's desk. So, I did exactly that. As a result, my fingerprints ended up on both the safe and the keys. That was enough evidence for the police. Then the company demanded I return the stolen money, and they took my apartment as part of the payment. Debt collectors followed me everywhere. They even scared Donald, so I hid him with a friend and went on the run for a bit. That's when they reported me to the authorities. I got on the longest bus route I could find, hoping to escape. But the debt collectors somehow always seemed to be one step behind me. So, I asked the bus driver to slow down at a sharp curve, and I jumped off near the woods. But I got lost. Eventually I ended up on the road where you found me. Why didn't you tell me all this right away? Why did you take off? Christian asked. I was scared you wouldn't believe me, Sandra replied. Then my friend called and told me Donald had been taken to a shelter. Grief overtook me and I ran to get him back. That's when they arrested me right in front of my son. His cries still echo in my mind, Sandra said, breaking down in tears. Christian stood by, unsure of how to comfort her. All right. Calm down, he said softly. I'll get a good lawyer. We'll clear your name and get you out of this mess. We'll live together. And don't forget about my mum. She's been itching to have someone new to bother with her complaints. Sandra let out a small laugh at Christian's attempt to cheer her up, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. Only Christian could make her laugh when she was this upset. 5 minutes later, the guard came to take Sandra away, and Christian stepped outside. He breathed in the fresh air, thinking, she'll be breathing the air of freedom soon too, as he dialed his lawyer. The legal team worked quickly. Within 2 days, Sandra was released on large bail, pending her trial. They drove home together. Mom! Christian had already informed Donald that she would be coming home that day, so he was waiting by the door. He ran straight into her arms, not even noticing the gift she had for him. They hugged for what felt like forever. Christian left them to their moment and headed to the kitchen to prepare a special dinner to celebrate. The household staff was happy to see kind, gentle Sandra back. They knew she would soon become the lady of the house. Barbara sat alone in her room, her expression cold and distant. Even when Sandra brought her a bouquet of her favorite flowers, Barbara didn't say a kind word, instead glaring as Christian and Donald happily hovered around Sandra. Just leave me alone. I'm tired, Barbara snapped. Donald ran over and kissed her forehead gently. Get some rest, Grandma. I'll come back later and we can read together, okay? The child said sweetly before leaving the room as the last to go. The boy's kindness surprised Barbara. who was prepared to hate everyone around her. Tears of anger welled up in her eyes as her thoughts spiraled. With the warmth of a young child's simple gesture, the bitterness that had frozen her heart began to melt. Why does Sandra deserve to be this happy? Barbara sobbed to herself. She took away my grandson, my own flesh and blood. What did I do to deserve all this? The next day, Christian showed Sandra around his office. She asked him for a job as a technician, not wanting to be a burden on him. We don't have any openings for janitors right now, but there's a position as a sales manager, Christian told her. You can start as an intern, working under someone more experienced, and then eventually manage on your own. Sandra hadn't expected this level of trust. Why are you crying again? Christian teased, pulling her in for a hug. You should be happy things are working out. Oh, I'm almost scared to be happy, Sandra confessed. Happiness is best kept quiet. But happiness was fleeting, and jealousy has a way of clouding people's judgment. Joe Reynolds, Christian's longtime business rival, whose company had always trailed behind, was determined to take Christian down however he could. One day, Joe caught Sandra as she was leaving the office, thrusting a bouquet of flowers at her. The prettiest flowers for the prettiest lady, he said with a sly grin. Who are you? Sandra recoiled, feeling uneasy. Joe Reynolds, longtime business acquaintance of your fiancé Christian, Joe replied smoothly. Why are you on your own today? Thanks for the flowers, Sandra responded awkwardly. But Christian's not my fiancé, and he's away for a couple of days on business. Well then, how about lunch? Joe suggested. When he saw her hesitate, he pushed further, saying, Great, it's settled. Let's go. I know the best Italian place. Before Sandra could gather her thoughts, she found herself sitting across from Joe at a restaurant. She was uncomfortable, and Joe could tell, enjoying every minute of it. Lunch seemed to drag on forever for Sandra. She gave brief replies to Joe's probing questions, but her appetite was completely gone. When the sleek car pulled up to the office entrance, Sandra stepped out, carrying the bouquet of flowers. The employees noticed, but kept quiet, brushing it off as a coincidence. By the end of the day, thanks to Joe's quick maneuvering, a single phone call to Carol Kennan, Howard's new secretary and an old friend, was all it took to get rumors swirling around the company. Word even reached Christian, or rather, Carol informed him as soon as he returned from his business trip. The mood at Christian's house was heavy, something Sandra picked up on immediately. Why the long face? Did something go wrong at work? She asked. Work's fine, Christian grumbled. It's you I'm worried about. Me? What are you talking about? Sandra was confused. People are saying you're only with me for the money and that you're running around with Joe Reynolds, my rival. You didn't even tell me about meeting him. I didn't have the chance to tell you yet. You just got home today. And anyway, he doesn't matter to me. He showed up at the office and said he's an old friend of yours, Sandra explained. But Christian's cold stare made her stop. He wouldn't look at her, and it hurt. They continued eating in silence. Christian was eating, but Sandra couldn't bring herself to take a bite. She didn't want to fight. If someone didn't trust her, what could she do? The next morning, Christian woke up to find Sandra packing her things, with their son Donald looking on in confusion. What are you doing? Christian asked, alarmed. We're leaving, Sandra replied firmly. I can't live in a house where I'm not trusted, where I'm seen as something I'm not, and I'm not going to prove myself to you. But I thought you lied to me and I can't take that, Christian said, his voice rising. My mum doesn't lie, Donald chimed in suddenly. But your mum is a liar, Christian shot back. Why? Donald asked, stunned. Dad, Grandma can walk. I saw her one time. She got up to look in the mirror and put on her pretty green earrings. She told me to keep it a secret. It was our game. Christian and Sandra stood frozen by the revelation. Sandra gave Christian a hard look and said, "Maybe you should deal with your own family before accusing others. And don't try to follow us. I'll be heading off to work." "Dad, I'm going to miss you," Donald murmured as he hugged Christian tightly, saying goodbye. Even though he knew he'd made a huge blunder, he didn't want to make things worse with Sandra. So he let her leave quietly without causing a scene. Christian was left standing alone in the middle of the room, completely baffled by how he had fallen into the trap set by his longtime nemesis and his mum. How could she lie and manipulate him for so many years? "Mum, we need to talk," Christian demanded as he entered her room. "Come down to the dining room. Are you here to mock a sick woman?" she snapped. "And that woman, did she leave? Donald, you better not have let her go." "He's my grandson! Stop with the lies!" Christian shouted in frustration. "Come downstairs. I know everything about you," Christian insisted. Barbara went pale. She was scared and obeyed her son's order without resistance. When she arrived in the dining room, Christian was already seated at the table with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. "Your favorite, Mom. Sit down. Let's toast to your recovery, and you can tell me why you've been lying to me all these years." Barbara poured herself and Christian some wine, taking a small sip of the deep red liquid. She closed her eyes as the familiar bitter taste filled her mouth. "I was scared you'd leave me," she admitted. "After Raymond passed, you started pulling away from me. Why did you side with Rachel over me? Couldn't you tell she didn't love me?" Christian pressed. "I saw myself in her. I thought she'd help you climb the social ladder. I was so sure it would turn out that way. It was her idea for me to fake being bedridden to make you take her back. And Sandra, I don't like her. She's not good enough for you or Donald. Well, that's everything. I'm going back to my room. I'm glad we've cleared the air." "I'm so tired of all this," Barbara said, leaving the room, while Christian sat there, his hand shaking around the glass. His own mother had betrayed him. What was the world coming to? In that moment, all he could see was Sandra's face, the one person who had been real with him. A wave of regret hit him, and he rushed to the hotel where Sandra and Donald were staying. "Please forgive me. I'm so sorry. Come back," Christian begged outside her door. But the hurt was too deep. Sandra silently closed the door, shutting out his plea. 3 days later, the trial concluded, and Sandra was declared innocent. The real culprits were ordered to pay her a significant amount as compensation for emotional distress. Overnight, Sandra found herself a wealthy woman. Christian was present at the trial, celebrating his beloved's victory, but at work, Sandra remained distant, acting as if her feelings for him had vanished, and openly entertained Joe's advances. This crushed Christian, who was consumed with jealousy. Joe, on the other hand, reveled in the thought that he had finally outplayed his rival. "Don't get your hopes up, Joe," Sandra told him one evening at a fancy restaurant. "I won't be your lover." "You still have feelings for that fool?" Joe asked, his tone sharp. "You could marry me and never want for anything. That would be the perfect way to settle the score with his family." "I don't hold any grudges against them," Sandra responded. "They helped me rebuild my life and saved me from prison. Besides, I'm done with you, Joe. I don't want to see you again." Enraged, Joe threw his napkin on the table and stormed out, leaving Sandra to cover the bill. As she settled up with the waiter, she felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted regarding Christian. But then, a wave of nausea hit her, and she hurried to the restroom. "Why am I feeling sick? Did I eat something bad?" she wondered. "Just what I need, food poisoning." But it wasn't food poisoning. The next day, a visit to the doctor confirmed the truth. Sandra was pregnant, already 4 weeks along. "Congratulations to you and your husband," the doctor smiled. "Time to say goodbye to junk food and heels for a while, and take it easy on the stress." Sandra left the doctor's office, with joy bubbling up inside her. She had always wanted a child with Christian, but now she faced the dilemma of telling him. She still felt hurt by his actions, but she also couldn't keep the news from him that he was about to become a father. She texted him, "Meet me at our cafe in an hour." When she arrived, the place was decorated with her favorite peonies, and there, sitting at the only table, was Christian. As she approached, he pulled a ring from his pocket. "Will you marry me?" Sandra's heart screamed yes, but she simply said, "No." Well, that's how women can be sometimes. They were vulnerable when it came to conflict, so men had to be patient and thoughtful. Christian was just that. He grinned, softening Sandra's frustration. He knew this wasn't the time to push back, but only for now. "I came to tell you I'm pregnant. It's your baby. There's nothing between Joe and me, and there never will be, got it?" Sandra nearly yelled. "Got it, sweetheart. I'm thrilled, you have no idea. And we're going to live separately." "Okay, darling, but don't call me darling." Her hormones were clearly getting the best of her, and Sandra couldn't help it. Christian understood. As she strode away, her heels clacking, a pair she had worn just for him, he watched her with a soft gaze. He dialed his lawyer. "Andrew, I've got something for you to handle." That same night, Christian arranged his will, leaving most of his estate to Sandra. "Get ready, Grandma," he joyfully told his mother. "You'll have 2 grandkids soon. Wake up and get ready to raise your grandchild from day 1. "She's pregnant? Oh, this is terrible," thought Barbara. "I want grandchildren, sure, but not with her. She's not one of us." The very next day, Barbara got the news that Christian had been in a car accident and was in a coma. Her world seemed to tilt. Stunned, she raced to the hospital, gathering the best doctors she could find. Her determination paid off. Christian's condition stabilized, but Barbara wasn't finished. She visited his lawyer and insisted Sandra be cut from the will. "I can't do that," Andrew Clark pushed back. "That would be illegal." "My son's in a coma, and I'm in charge now," she argued fiercely. "I'll return tomorrow, and you'd better have the right answer. Otherwise, I'll take this higher. I have powerful friends." Sandra found out about the accident days later while at work. She dropped everything and rushed to the hospital. Once there, she hurried to Christian's side, collapsing into the chair next to his bed in tears. "Please, step out. Only family is allowed here," the nurse said, summoning security. They moved to escort her out, but she resisted. "Let go of me. I'm his fiancé." "Release her," a faint voice suddenly said. "Doctor, the patient's awake." The nurse ran to get the doctor. Sandra clung to Christian's hand, sobbing, guilt-ridden tears streaming down her face as she kissed his hand. "So, are you going to marry me now?" Christian asked, wincing in pain. "I will. I'll marry you. I'd follow you anywhere. Just stay with me. Stay alive," Sandra cried out. Christian smiled weakly. "Well, I guess I really have no choice now. And forgive me for everything it eats, he added. The nurses huddled quietly behind them, their hearts swelling at the emotional reunion of 2 proud, loving souls. Some even discreetly wiped away a tear. After finding out from his lawyer about his mother's betrayal, Christian silently packed up and left the house without answering her desperate questions or apologies. He cut all ties, never inviting her to the wedding or Jessica's christening. Barbara's only hope was for a single annual birthday. Message from the son she had alienated through her own actions. One warm summer afternoon, as the family enjoyed the cool breeze in the garden, Sandra turned to Christian. "Jessica turns 3 tomorrow. Should we invite Barbara? Maybe it's time to let go of all the grudges. After all, she is your mother." "And how do you feel about it?" Christian asked. "I'm happy with you, and I've learned how to protect my own joy. Don't worry about me," Sandra smiled as she playfully ruffled his hair. The next evening, a frail elderly woman hesitantly approached the garden, where the family was gathered on the patio. The children were the first to notice her. "Grandma, you're here," Donald shouted as he ran toward her, with chubby little Jessica waddling behind him, echoing her brother. "Grandma," they both cried. Barbara dropped to her knees, hugging her grandchildren tightly, sobbing for all the years she had lost due to her own pride and mistakes. "Well, now the family is truly together," Sandra said softly, wrapping her arms around Christian. She knew that from now on, things would be okay. If you liked this story, don't forget to show your support with a like and a comment. Wishing you all the best.